a gift has meaning within a specific context. Something we haven't talked about as much this week. Focusing on the context of a gift exchange, I think, can shed more light on patronage and reciprocity more than merely speaking about the word gift and what we assume with it. So we are going to reflect on the significance of reciprocity within two particular settings: cultures and relationships. Now, this talk specifically focuses on reciprocity within a Chinese context, because we will use Chinese culture as a case study to enable us to see the significance of social exchange within different types of relationships. So let's consider the following perspectives. In a famous court case in 2006, a man was accused of knocking over an elderly woman from a bus, and despite the fact that there was no corroborating evidence, no video, no witnesses, and whatnot, the judge ruled against him. And by the way, he took her to the hospital, helped the lady out, took her to the hospital, actually paid about $30 in medical fees, whatnot, just to help her. So, but she ended up suing him and for knocking her over, but there was no evidence that he had done it. Well, the judge ruled against him and in favor of the woman, saying, this is what he said: no one would, in good conscience, help someone unless they felt guilty. And there are numerous cases like that. So in 2013, this woman, similar situation, a lady fell. The older lady accused the woman of pushing her. But this woman helped the fallen woman to the hospital and even paid some of her medical bills, just her initial $33, whatnot. And it was later proven that this woman had not, the cameras showed clearly she had not been guilty of that. But the woman, the elderly woman, said, if it wasn't you who bumped me, why would you have helped me and taken me to the hospital? There's numerous cases like this, and it has tragic consequences when people all of a sudden are so afraid to help. And there have literally been deaths because people were left alone. So in this context, a gift was viewed with suspicion, even though everything, there was no reason to doubt it. Now, on the one hand, we know that our relationships with other people will influence how they interpret gifts. Within shallow one-dimensional relationships, gifts will be considered as bribes. Within long-term, multifaceted relationships, they're going to be expressions of love and loyalty. So in some sense, the norms of social exchange are common sense. On the other hand, oftentimes the ideas and practices that are most common to us are often the most complex when you start digging deeper. And if you want to see the complexity of a concept, just start looking at context. So let's look at the Chinese context. A significant form of reciprocity in Chinese culture is called renqing, which a wooden translation is human feelings. Now, renqing describes a voluntary reciprocal exchange between individuals based on emotional attachment. So sentiment perpetuates social exchange as people continue to foster mutual affection. Now, renqing is one way people establish relationships, or guanxi. Guanxi divides into three types: obligatory, reciprocal, and utilitarian. And you can see various examples of those three types of relationships. Now, renqing only exists within non-familial relationships. Chinese do not regard the give and take of family relationships as renqing. Rather, helping one's relatives are your obligation. It's what you should do. So in this sense, obligation is distinct from renqing. Family relationships entail fundamental obligations or duties without any sense of one's feeling, without respect to one's feelings. So people are responsible to protect and secure the needs of family members. One scholar summarizes gift giving in families and saying, the relationships within a family in China are too sacred to be bound by the obligation to reciprocate. Now, exchanging resources among family is a moral imperative. By contrast, renqing only has a slight moral connotation. It primarily concerns wisdom, etiquette, propriety. Someone who knows how to properly exchange renqing understands how to manage interpersonal relationships. Now, exchanging gifts or favors primarily serves two interconnected functions. First, it establishes relationships with others. And by this, I mean the initiation, the maintenance, and the deepening of relationships. Second, gift giving sows the seeds of obligation, slight obligation, which will someday bear fruit in the form of return favors. Now, exchange rituals are so basic that not giving gifts or exchanging favors will eventually end friendships. Friendships are consciously pragmatic, often initiated with practical concerns in mind. They're initiated for some time when there might be a need. They are less likely to stem from some common interest, some hobby. Now, one could summarize Chinese renqing or reciprocity with the phrase, give in order to receive. Now, before criticizing this perspective as selfish or unbiblical, a few observations can help us nuance this Chinese notion of reciprocity. First, I'd point to David Silva's presentation, which reminds us that Jesus promised rewards to those who are generous to the needy. For example, Matthew 6, Matthew 10. But what about Jesus' admonition? It is more blessed to give than to receive, from Acts 20. Well, first of all, we ought to notice that Jesus does give motivation for giving. That is blessing. There's blessing in this. Second, Chinese creatively combine the two actions so that the former, giving, is the means to the latter, receiving. While one is blessed to give, you're doubly blessed if you also receive. So Chinese reciprocity creates a win-win scenario. In this way, sharing resources limits competition by fostering cooperation. In effect, this approach is one strategy to dealing with the so-called limited good phenomenon. Now, basic human experience reminds us that Chinese reciprocity is not inherently selfish, and in fact, this description of renqing can be seen in various ways in other cultures. On the one hand, doing favors and giving gifts are natural ways to initiate friendships even in the West. Think about when someone moves into your neighborhood. You may bring them a meal or some other gift. Now, Chinese use various sorts of rituals and whatnot to foster renqing, reciprocity among friends, such as banquets, hosting meals, giving gifts. Over time, this perpetual social exchange forms relationships that can approximate kinship relationships. Now, on the other hand, friendships thrive when people exchange favors and gifts. Few genuine friendships survive one-way relationships, as when a friend perpetually refuses to invest in another person, whether in the form of favors, advice, encouragement. And so we could conclude and say that Chinese are simply less naive and more sober-minded about the nature of friendships and relationships. Some people call it calculating. I call it sober. Another aspect of Chinese reciprocity that is noteworthy which is noteworthy because it's not often present in other contexts. In China, the gift giver typically is the social inferior rather than the person with higher status. In other words, the social superior gains honor in other contexts, gains honor by giving gifts, but in this case, it's the opposite. Now, what's the purpose of the lower status person giving gifts? In effect, he is seeking to establish a relationship in order to perhaps secure favors when the time comes. Gift givers do not always have a specific favor in mind at the time. After all, simply having a broad relational network is an asset and is valuable. And as we connect people in our networks together, you become a giver on both ends. And you're initiating relationships not within mind of I'm taking something necessary from them, but you could have the idea of I'm going to be giving. And so you're a giving broker in that sense. Now, a few overarching principles govern renqing exchanges and are reflected in numerous idioms. First, pay back more than you receive. This point ensures ongoing sense of indebtedness between parties. 2, limit how much you receive from others. This protects recipients against becoming indebted beyond their ability to repay. 3rd, never directly ask someone to return favors. And this final point treats, if you do that, this would mean that you're treating the relationship as a mere transactional relationship. But with renqing, remember, human feelings should govern the relationship, not the desire to achieve a transaction. Now, if people do not want friendship, what can they do? They could use some of the following 4 strategies. Now, each one of these strategies assumes that person An initiates friendship by giving a gift to an unwilling person, Zhang. Person Zhang could never pay back the renqing. Maybe he doesn't accept the gift, which is an implicit refusal of friendship. Person Zhang immediately repays on the gift, rather than having some sort of a delay. Person Zhang repays the gift with a gift of less or almost exact value. Those are all ways in which you could say, I don't want a relationship. Now, by contrast, how could you encourage friendship? Person John could respond in these 3 ways. He could give a gift of greater value. He could give a timely gift, or give a gift that's particularly suited to person on. Maybe there's some interest that they have. They collect this, or they really have a hobby in this, and so it's just so fitting to that particular person. Such intentionality signals that An and Zhang's relationship transcends a specific transaction. Now, this leads us now to another key question. Why does reciprocity differ across cultures? I think Chinese culture highlights a facet that can help us as we analyze cultures and think about the dynamics of patronage and reciprocity in our own context. I'm going to focus on one particular answer. A researcher, Peng Mei, studied the differences between gift giving in China and in Germany. And she says that when invited to a boss's birthday party, 26.6% of Chinese would give expensive presents, okay? While only 3.33% of Germans would do so. Now, what's interesting here is that both cultures are long-term pragmatic orientations. In that sense, there's a sense in which you might expect the numbers to be at least a little bit closer. So why the statistical gap? She suggests that within Germany, there is far more influence by individualism and this value for equality. And so therefore, within Germany and the Western culture in general, there is a clear-cut line between the public and private spheres. Public and private spheres. So she's suggesting that the individualistic versus the collectivistic distinction can help us explain people's different responses to their bosses. But I want us to develop this idea a little bit further. People loosely describe collectivistic cultures as those that prioritize the group over the individual, and by contrast, individualistic cultures are those that prioritize the individual over the group. But of course, these are general, simplistic descriptions. They merely stress characteristics that tend to be prominent within certain cultures. So I do want to throw in that qualification. However, these categories are so useful for emphasizing certain aspects of cultures. Now, broadly speaking, Chinese emphasize what's called the collective self, the Dawo, if you know Chinese, above the Xiaowo, the little self. the individual self. Now, the former depends on one's similarities to others, whereas the little self, it talks about your identity as distinct from the community, how I am different. Now, given a collectivistic perspective, Chinese do not sharply dichotomize the public and the private spheres. The public-private distinction is more prominent in individualistic cultures, where people assume multiple separate identities. So one's public role, such as being an employee, should not affect private relationships. Fostering a close personal relationship with one's boss could even be deemed inappropriate in most Western contexts. Western friendships often center on common interests, books, sports, hobbies. So belonging to the same interest-based social group rarely entails any sort of responsibility or sense of debt. Group members only relate within a narrow sphere of life. Now, they might not have meaningful relationships beyond that shared interest. A Westerner who divides his relationship in this way can theoretically belong to an infinite number of social groups. Social identity at any given moment is temporary, it's transient. One's personal sense of identity across countless groups is most likely defined by an individual's particularities, his distinctive characteristics. So, how do these factors influence reciprocity? Western individualism tends to limit the quantity and quality of reciprocal exchanges. And this is due to the restricted scope and longevity of social relationships. In addition, by partitioning one's relational network, a person has limited ability to develop the sort of reputation and trust across community that would encourage social exchange. Now, by contrast, Chinese people tend to prioritize relationships based on common background, whether your hometown, language, so forth. Commonality transcends the individual. Who we are, not merely what I do, determines identity. Now, this view of identity is more likely to sustain reciprocal relationships over time. So we come to the question, what is the relationship between collectivism and reciprocity? To answer this question, we should observe the link between trust, collectivism, and reciprocity. As trust increases between people, so does reciprocity. Now, multiple factors influence whether one trusts another person. If you and I belong to the same group, we're more likely to trust one another than we are trusting outsiders. Now, these observations seem obvious, but they mask several distinctions, several features with practical implications. For instance, because humans are social beings, even so-called individualistic cultures or subcultures have collectivist tendencies. All people simultaneously belong to multiple groups. Families, classmates, sport teams, unions, organizations, just a few examples. So to understand the link between collectivism and reciprocity, one has to further clarify the meaning of group. What group? What do you mean by group? What does it mean to belong to the same in-group? What separates insiders and outsiders? In recent scholarship, researchers have distinguished two types of collectivism: categorical collectivism and relational collectivism. So to illustrate the difference, imagine that each image here represents different types of people. At one level, individualists only marginally define themselves as members of a collective. Here's an individualist. At any given time, the individual may move into a circle or not. But his or her self-identity is more his distinctions from the others. Now, people from so-called individualistic cultures usually are called categorical collectivists. That's important here. Individualists are categorical collectivists. Now, what does that mean? One scholar writes that in this case, group membership is defined in terms of prototypical properties that are shared among members of a common in-group. Okay? Being an athlete, common alumni, being a Texas A&M Aggie. Thank you. Common features of that. Okay? Oftentimes Sunday school classes in churches are divided by these sorts of groups. Now, by contrast, East Asian cultures typically perceive groups as primarily relationship-based. Some relational collectivists primarily identify with those that they are with whom they are interdependent and have ongoing interaction. Some close relationships, such close relationships transcend abstract categories. They stress cooperation and loyalty, maintaining group harmony. Now, because these two forms of collectivism prioritize different groups, their definitions of inside are differ. So let's consider the relationship between collectivism and trust. Categorical collectivists have larger in-groups, very broad, a broader radius of trust. On the other hand, relational collectivists have a smaller in-group, with a narrower radius of trust, because their trust extends to only those with whom they have personal interaction with and interdependence with, not merely common characteristics such as ethnicity, gender, or whatnot. Now, I've already said that trust and reciprocity have a positive correlation. But at this point, we also need to distinguish between two types or two kinds of reciprocity: balanced and unbalanced reciprocity. Relational collectivists, what we might call traditional collectivists, are more accustomed to unbalanced reciprocity or altruistic reciprocity. Chinese renqing is an example of unbalanced reciprocity. Partners perpetuate their debt to one another through unbalanced exchange of gifts and favors. But categorical collectivists, what we call individualists, usually favor balanced reciprocity. Now, studies have repeatedly shown them to be uncomfortable with unequal exchanges. They don't like social debts, whether in their favor or against them. Either way, there's a discomfort that researchers find again and again. Now, these two types of collectives affect how group members extend trust. It's not just as simple as you're in or you're out. For categorical collectivists, trust is based on common affinity or shared attributes, hence a broad trust, radius of trust. Reciprocity and trust interact in a different manner. 3 observations are noteworthy. First, because categorical collectivists emphasize balanced exchange, reciprocity is akin to a transaction. Therefore, reciprocity plays less of a role in forming and sustaining close relationships. Second, people are primed to think of their group identity only when their categorical group, their categorical collective, is explicitly contrasted with another. For example, that conscious comparison has to be made known. So if you're a Yankees fan, you might only show your Yankee colors, as it were, if somebody else starts bragging about the Red Sox or talking bad about your team. Now all of a sudden, that's what you identify as. But unless there's an explicit contrast, that identity kind of falls behind you. So in these sort of collectives, individuals are less concerned with cooperation or harmonious relationships. They're constantly navigating different groups, and so it's just simply not as much of a priority. Reciprocity is more instrumental than affection-based. Social exchange is based on the principle of equity using cost-benefit analysis. Third, reciprocity is an unfitting and impractical means of forming one's categorical collective identity. You're not going to use reciprocity and social exchange to define yourself in the categorical collective. It doesn't affect social identity based on shared attributes. you're in because of the attributes. So a person has limited resources such as time and money. So it's unreasonable to expect individuals to maintain ongoing social exchange with such a broad circle of insiders. All Texans, all Brits, all whatever. Now, relational collectivists are more discriminate. Unbalanced reciprocity is well suited to foster trust. So these people engender positive affections for one another by exchanging favors and extending their mutual social debt. So in this case, reciprocity does determine closeness. Relational collectivists form in-groups that are particular rather than categorical. Unbalanced reciprocity builds trust and so helps Chinese discriminate between those with whom they should share resources and those with whom they shouldn't. In short, relational or Chinese collectivism or reciprocity is a form of paying it forward. Favors serve as deposits, which accrue with time and return to the giver with increased value. Now, the two types of collectivism explain research findings that seem to be counterintuitive. Scholars characterize the relational collectivists in general terms, claiming that collectivists prioritize the group over the individual. But by contrast, we expect individualists to show less consideration for insiders because they stress their own needs above the group. In fact, categorical collectivists, that is, individualists, consistently show stronger bias towards their in-group compared to relational collectivists. Now, how do we make sense of that? The explanation lies in how we define in-group and those differences. Relational collectivists are less trusting of people who belong to their categorical in-group, ethnicity, nationality, gender, because without an established relationship, such as with strangers, why should there be trust? Chinese is not simply going to trust another person who's Chinese simply because they're Chinese. Americans will, very frequently. So this helps reconcile what seems to be conflicting research. So how do we apply the distinction between categorical collectives and relational collectives? Theologically speaking, the church is a categorical collective. It consists of followers of Jesus Christ who share common values, convictions, beliefs, and practices in the story. From our observations, we can anticipate that the church will face certain challenges. Sharing attributes and a common affinity does not guarantee enduring social ties or that transcends social context. An individual belongs to multiple social groups. Someone might only have an enhanced sense of belonging to the church when other people criticize the church or criticize Jesus or want to compete with it. Then they wear Team Jesus colors. In effect, one easily begins to regard the church as a type of volunteer society. And the problem is exacerbated in China, where Chinese are not prone to trust people in the same broad social category. So how might Christians respond? Christians should move from seeing the church as merely as a categorical collective, to forming the church into a relational collective. When believers initially meet, they're not linked by personal interaction. Developing close relationships occurs through the exchange of grace or gifts. This give and take creates enduring relationships that transcend theological and ideological unity. Ultimately, the church must forge a unity based on practice, not mere principles alone. Based on connection, not merely creed. The choice of where one lives can also hinder churches from becoming relational collectives. If people attend a church far from their home, they have limited opportunities to engage in social exchange, which deepens close contacts. So in practice, their work and neighborhood relationships will have more significant effect on their social identity. Now, I have written a post on this particular, explaining this further, but we can use these observations to help analyze the church in China and other contexts. For the most part, the Chinese church is not organized by denominations, but by networks. collective. And when we say that, what kind of category? What's the nature of the relationship? Is it based on geography, creedal confession, personal interactions, reverence for a leader, and ministry philosophy? So it's not just enough to say, oh, the church is a categorical collective or relational collective. We still have to ask, what's the nature of it? So a healthy church will draw from both types of collectives. The categorical collectives enable us to be more embracing, overcoming of social barriers. Relational collectives are the context where love happens, personalized, enduring relationships. Now, in missionary relationships, working among Chinese, missionaries working among Chinese are often confused by the norms of social exchange. And this limits their ability to form enduring relationships with locals or nationals. Even worse, it can cause irreparable relationship damage. Do I need to restart this? Okay. Okay. Is it up? Okay. All right, thank you. Now, these problems are rooted in one's almost imperceptible assumptions about social identity. Specifically, when most Westerners cross cultures, these categorical collectivists are biased against unbalanced reciprocity because they want balanced reciprocity. So they're more likely to struggle with close long-term relationships. Westerners tend to misunderstand why Chinese exchange gifts. Many foreigners are surprised to receive a gift from a stranger upon first meeting, and they wonder, what's your motive? What are you after? When really all they're trying to do is just start a friendship. That's how you start a friendship. They're not necessarily looking for anything else than maybe you are when you are saying, hi, where are you from? Tell me about yourself. For them, it's the exact same thing. But in order to avoid debt, the missionary too quickly wants to repay the favor or avoid the person. So missionaries should be both intentional and informed with respect to social exchange. And in the Fuller paper, which I will eventually make available on my blog, I mention all kinds of research and it shows where Chinese have shown offense and hurt by the gifts, the thoughtless gifts that are given. Things like wine and flowers and gift cards were seen as impersonal. So we need to learn the unwritten rules of social exchange. And there are all kinds of other things, for example. So if you were to give a gift and you wanted to give, you would not give, for example, 250 kwai or renminbi, because 250 in Chinese is a short form of saying idiot. You need to get 249 or 251. I'm not kidding. Yes. So receiving a favor does not necessarily enslave somebody, as some might think. In fact, you can actually modulate the quality of relationships through your willingness to receive gifts. Evangelism. Chinese Christians often use social exchange as a means for evangelism. At a basic level, it creates a subtle social obligation on converts to attend church activities. But the intriguing thing is that this sense of debt does not go towards the individual, but to the congregation as a whole. So the Chinese will use gifts, but not for their own personal advantage, but for the sake of the community and for connecting the individual, the outsider, to the community, which is completely countercultural. So the church has 4 strategies. Typically, these tend to be implicit rather than overtly known or stated. But favors are often provided anonymously to perfect strangers with no expectation of return and to persons of lower status. And so therefore, the outsider does not see gifts as calculated and manipulative because the benefit is going to, or the relationship, the connection, whatnot, a potential benefit goes to the congregation, not the individual. They are expressions of love. Chinese effectively take out the reciprocity, the standard reciprocity gift exchange, and by dividing groups into two, the family and outsiders, as opposed to this sense of individual give and take and this renqing. They effectively remove that element. Now, social exchange among Christians subverts Chinese hierarchical norms in this way. And what ends up happening is that there's stories of older men who will kind of wear their authority on their sleeve and say, I've done this for you, you need to serve me. But then when upon conversion, they will all of a sudden start washing the dishes, cleaning the house, doing the sorts of things that Chinese men just don't do. And that ends up being a mark of their conversion, in which they, by how they change their rules of social reciprocity. And so, this is what one man said, and his family, basically turned to Christ because of what they saw, the transformation from that attitude. We can also use reciprocity for what's called the Benjamin Franklin effect. And that is we can love our enemies by actually asking for things from them, asking for favors. And so if you look up the Benjamin Franklin effect, you'll see that. But the idea was that he had this guy who was very critical of him. And what he did was he knew that this guy had a book that Benjamin Franklin wanted. So he went to him and said, hey, can I borrow this book? And eventually, through that exchange, his enemy started to be endeared to Benjamin Franklin. They became longtime friends and allies. And so, consequently, by actually putting yourself in debt, that actually brought reconciliation with an enemy. Not a giving a gift and reconciling, but a lowering. Other applications, implications include rethinking a theology of grace. Chinese, within this idea of reciprocity and social exchange, face two temptations. The first is easy believism, saying that if I just, as conversion is a transaction, if I say the sinner's prayer, if I get baptized, then I'm in. The second temptation, however, is that people confuse the relationship between grace and works such that the latter becomes meritorious as a way of gaining favor with God. But the key to overcoming some of these challenges is recovering the circularity of grace, as John Barclay has pointed out, where our ought to becomes our want to. Very frequently, when somebody does a favor for you, they will say, I'll translate, oh, I ought to, like it's my duty. Whereas typical Westerner will, I don't want it to be your duty, I want you to do it because you want to. But that is what they mean, because they want to deepen that sense of eventual goal of having a kinship relationship with you, that, where it's an ought to. Now, I will, because my time has expired, I will make this available on my blog website in the next week or two. I have a number of other applications. I will simply preview them for your sake. Growing the church. This has multiple implications for growing the church multiplication, church maturity, contemporary church planning strategies that emphasize rapidity inherently undermine this developing of relationship collectivism. It just simply requires time. They tend to be more transactional. The whole process of moving from kinship to relationship to becoming a family church, which is the way you translate the underground church, just simply requires time. It requires adopting a familial perspective that doesn't seek immediate transformation. Try that with your spouse or kids. Change. It won't work. But yet, we will do that in our ministry strategies. Finally, this whole phenomenon of reciprocity, understanding how the interrelationship between gift exchange and group identity makes us rethink problems like, well, what do we do if people just want handouts? How does that work out? Well, we have to start emphasizing more what it means to be an insider in the church and prioritizing the church as our family, as opposed to taking the saying the church exists for outsiders too extreme, to where people seem to be so secret friendly that they become believer useless. And it is amazing how when you have this idea of nurturing the family of God and prioritizing certain resources for the family of God, people will say you're a bubble, you're insular. But no one says that about your family and your kids if you prioritize your family. No one says your family is such a bubble because you prioritize your kids. So it's very peculiar. So, there's a number of other questions we could ask, but I'll conclude here. If you do not know my website, you can find some notes, and then eventually you'll find a rough manuscript posted there. It's at jacksonwoo.org. All right, thank you.